Well, good afternoon if you are in the Norwegian part of Brooklyn. Good evening if you are in Norway or anywhere else listening in Europe. Special love and greetings and solidarity, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong, be yourselves. Greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. Today is October 28th, 2022, and I'm putting a date stamp on today's conversation because it's really special to me. When I began working with Idagio in April of 2020, I made a very short list of about 7 artists who I wanted to have join me on this program. I've had the other 6, and it's been worth the wait to have today's artist, Leif Ove Andsnes, magnificent pianist, Norwegian. Before we talk to him, though, I want to tell something to all of you listeners. Starting November 2nd, I'm doing a 4-part course called Making Sense of Giuseppe Verdi that you can sign up for on Idagio. Go to idagio.com. I will have guests such as Thomas Hampson, Gregory Kundi, Latonia Moore, Eleonora Burato. I don't want to leave people out, Lucas Salsi, Nadine Sierra, and many, many more. And we're going to take a deep dive into the entire life and work of Giuseppe Verdi over 4 weeks. So Making Sense of Verdi on idagio.com. Leif Ove Andsnes has caught my attention a very, very long time ago, and welcome, Leif Ove.
Thank you very much.
I need to tell you first, Leif Ove, that I have a particular love and fascination for your country, Norway, that began even before you were born, so it's not about you. Norway is the first foreign country for me as an American that I became aware of. And the reason for that, and I mentioned Brooklyn, is because Brooklyn used to have a large commercial port, and Norwegian ships would arrive in the port in Brooklyn. And my parents, when I was about 2 or 2.5 years old, took me to a Norwegian church every weekend. It was called the Norwegian Seamen's House, where Norwegian mariners would stay, and they'd have a church, and they'd have a smorgasbord. And we, for very little money, would eat Norwegian food every weekend. And it was my first foreign cuisine. I've come to be known for Italian food, but my palate, my sense of experimentation with food and many things was formed on Norwegian food. And so I began to want to know a lot about Norway very early, and I discovered quite early the plays of Henrik Ibsen and dedicated myself to reading the entire Ibsen canon. I studied with a professor named Harald Ness, a Norwegian, all of Ibsen. He became my favorite playwright. This led me in part to Edvard Grieg, Norway's most famous composer. And when I was a child, I was in the New York City Chorus, and we performed at Carnegie Hall, and I was asked to sing a solo by Edvard Grieg from the Olaf Tryggvason suite. And so my first performance at Carnegie Hall, not that I've done too many, was singing Edvard Grieg. So it became my goal to travel to Norway. And I finally did in August of 1992. I will tell you, Leif Ove, another time the whole story. But I traveled with King Harold and Queen Sonja to Finnmark. And I was with them for 2 weeks. And then I traveled around Norway visiting Ibsen sites. I didn't get to Grieg sites yet. And then on June 15th of 1993, I gave a talk in Bergen, Norway, about Grieg. And unless I'm completely mistaken, that is the first time I heard you perform. That was the 150th anniversary of the birth of Edvard Grieg, and you played the famous piano concerto. And from that point forward, I followed everything that you've done in your career. So that's a little bit of an introduction.
But this is very
why
because I have to tell you that my great grandparents met in Brooklyn, and
Oh, really?
and my family has a long story there on my mother's side, and they would surely be at that Siemens church,
Huh.
and they were very much part of that environment. And my mother lived also on Long Island when she was between the age of 4 and 9, I think. And so we have all sorts of there's a long history with my family with Brooklyn and with New York. And
So did you grow up, you grew up in a small town in southwestern Norway, hearing about New York and knowing of New York and America in a particular way?
oh, very much so. And when my grandparents moved back to Norway in the 50s, there were different reasons for that. My grandmother's brother was suddenly very sick, and there were then they had some money to be able to build a big house, which was, happened to be very close to where I grew up. So I could just walk there 2 minutes. I was at my grandparents' house always, and it was sort of the biggest house in the area.
Mhm.
And I always heard how they were able to build that because of what they made some money in New York. And of course I heard all those stories, and they even made some films from garden parties and so on from early 50s. And so I carry that very much with me. And my great grandfather was a really one of a kind. He was always at boats, and he went to Alaska, and he had 2 children at home, but actually was in America for 25 years without seeing his children.
Mm.
My grandmother married, but I mean, people were poor in Norway at the time, and he had to make money. And he stayed, and he always sent money. Every couple of months, he would send money home. My grandmother said that her greatest sorrow in life was when she married, and he had promised to finally come home, and he didn't. But 1 year later, he was there, and but it was amazing. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine 25 years away from your family?
It's not an exaggeration to say that there is an unusual and very particular bond between Norway and the United States. You could say that with many countries because my country knows immigration from everywhere. But this relationship is particular. I'm sure you've met King Harold. And I remember that when I met him for the first time and we were talking, he told me of growing up in the White House during World War II. He and his sister lived with the Roosevelts and were raised, in fact, by Eleanor Roosevelt, while their parents, King Olav, and I forget his wife's name, were home in Norway during World War II. And so that Harold's very early experiences, in a way, were not like mine. I didn't grow up with the King of Norway, but he grew up with the President and First Lady of the United States and learned English and developed a very special feeling for the United States. And you can see this in all kinds of exchanges between Norwegians and Americans, even if there are political disagreements on occasion. But the bond is unusually strong. And I always celebrate May 17th, which is the Norwegian National Day, with a big plate of herring and all kinds of other Norwegian things. And I'm very aware of your country through its art. And as I said, particularly Ibsen, who formed my worldview of what is moral, what is correct, where there's injustice. So when our former president here referred to an enemy of the people, I don't think he knew that he was referring to a play by Henrik Ibsen about the media being independent and declaring when things are not being done right by government officials, by medical officials, by whoever is doing that. And every one of Ibsen's plays, for me, explored what it means to be a person, so that my formation, my worldview, yes, I'm a New Yorker, and yes, I have a passion for Italy, and my life has been there too, but I can never discount my very strong sense of being formed by Norwegian culture, ideas, and ultimately, when I started going there, by nature. And I kind of remember, my pronunciation of Norwegian is not great. So Haugaland, I believe, is where you're from. And
That's
I've been
fair,
there.
right?
And I remember incredible white sand beaches. I remember heather. I remember seeing heather everywhere as if I were in Scotland. And I mean, basically, they're across the sea from one another, Scotland and southern Norway. And I have been in almost every fjord. People who don't know what are called the Laps are known as the Sami people. And this is northern Norway. And I went to visit the Samis. I learned to cook Sami food, a dish called bidos, which is a reindeer stew. And I asked the elder of the people how she makes it. And she said, get a reindeer, cut it in half, add water.
Yeah, they just cook everything in water. Yeah. No,
And
maybe to explain also, because I'm from the western part of Norway,
yeah,
as you know, the southwest, and from an island called Karmøy, and especially that area, of course, there were so many people emigrating to America, like my great grandfather and so much of my family actually, and so it's very different from where you come from. If you're more from the east, if you're from the Oslo area, there were not so many people that have connections to but it's very much part of the area where I come from, to want to go out at sea and explore, the world. Seems to be in the blood of the people from Norway.
it's very outward facing. It's this magnificent coastline with all kinds of inlets and fjords and so on. But everyone that I've met in the western part of Norway, especially Bergen, but throughout and all the way up north, there's a sense of awareness of the world outside, whereas people further east inland in Norway are more contained, and they're either farmers or skiers or everything that people do in Oslo. I just want to add one more thing about the Sami people. If they take you to their heart, they create something called a yoik, which is a song of tribute. And you get your own song. And what struck me, I was honored to be given not only a yoik, but a Sami knife. And when they give you a knife, that's to say that they trust you enough that they would present a knife to you, which, if I were not of good intentions, could use to stab someone. But instead, it was a knife of friendship. And I have in my memory all kinds of experiences with Norwegians. They're very vivid, palpable people to me. And I think sometimes they're thought of as being mild, calm Scandinavians and so on. To me, it's Viking blood, but it's art. It's an awareness of nature. To me, when I hear Wagner's Fliegende Holländer, I hear Norwegian seas and coasts. When I hear so much of Grieg, I hear the nation. And sometimes we talk about national composers and their depiction of their nation or being representatives of their nation, especially nations such as yours with small populations. Is that an exaggeration, or do you find that in Grieg there really might be something that expresses Norwegian character?
It's always difficult to know what came first. Yes, of course, Grieg uses the Norwegian folk music as part of his language, the folk dances, the folk songs, and his melodies in general, when even in a piece like the piano concerto, they are not operatic big melodies. They are rather simple and like spoken almost, and I think that's part of the appeal. But Grieg has also such a signature in its harmonies and everything. I mean, you hear, there are very few composers who have that. You hear two bars and immediately that must be Grieg. and we have taken that to our hearts, of course, and think that that sounds very Norwegian.
Mhm.
But maybe it's Grieg's signature, maybe
It could be.
that's not specifically Norwegian, but maybe it's specifically Grieg, that personality. But then there are folk rhythms, and he used the open strings of that hardanger fiddle,
Mhm.
in Morning Mood of Peer Gynt. I mean, there are all kinds of connections with Norwegian folk tradition. So it's a complicated question to answer, actually. What came first, the Norwegian spirit or Grieg himself with his signature, with his strong
Do you
signature?
feel as a Norwegian that people expect you to be an exponent of your country, or can you be Leif Ove Andsnes, pianist who happens to be from Norway?
Well, I happen to love his music, but it's of course not as inexhaustible as the world of Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, and so I don't play him all the time. And a piece like the Piano Concerto, which was very much my breakthrough piece, and I it's wonderful for a young Norwegian pianist to have that piece written by a young composer wanting to conquer the world, and that's part of the piece. He was 25, and he says, "Here I am," and what an amazing period of inspiration he had just then. For me, I sometimes think that was, that's when he wrote some of his best music, because he later on he had also complexes and so on. But I find it sometimes strange that I read that, that I'm such an expert on Grieg's music, and because I've played much more Beethoven, or
Yeah.
but that's how it is, it's and I'm not unhappy about it, because
Sure.
I feel very close to Grieg's music.
I'd like to get to Beethoven in a bit, but I want to talk to you a little bit more about Norway and music, and Norway and the arts, specifically the fact that both Grieg and Ibsen, though Norwegian, spent a great deal of time in Germany and Italy. Grieg studied in Germany. He performed a lot in Germany. He was an international pianist, not only a composer, and he would tour all across the continent. He had a lung condition. He had a very deficient left lung, if I recall, and therefore the Norwegian winters would be too hard for him. So he would spend time in Sorrento and elsewhere in southern Italy. And he toured, and he went with his wife, Nina. They had a child who sadly died very, very, very young, and therefore it was just the two of them. And he composed many songs on Nina's voice. She was a soprano. Ibsen more or less exiled himself. He wrote about Norwegian issues and concerns, although you could say they're about the world, but he did it from abroad. And when he came back to Norway, inevitably there were arguments and debates and so on. And every Ibsen play that came out caused another scandal, because he would tackle yet another taboo issue that was all about human nature that the Greeks and Shakespeare would tackle. But Ibsen did it with a degree of realism and plain-spokenness. It didn't have the floral language or the very distinct language of Shakespeare, but it had the language of the people. And I always wonder about, especially for Scandinavia, when its artists and writers and sculptors go elsewhere, and how living abroad focuses and sharpens their view of their homelands by comparing it to other places. In your study of these great artists, of Norwegian artists, and the fact that you traveled the world, do you sense any kindred spirit or deeper understanding of their views of Norway based on being a Norwegian who's often out in the world?
Well, I mean, of course, Norway was too small for these personalities, and we are so geographically, we are, but especially we're very isolated. we were also a colony under Sweden. I mean, first under Denmark, and we got our independence in 1907 and 05, sorry, which Grieg happily got to experience. You know, he died 2 years later. Yeah, it's clear. I mean, with somebody like Grieg, he was always he always says he was longing to the other place. You know, when he was at home, he felt everything was so provincial, and he hated the musical life. That was trying to do something. He was trying to be the chief conductor in Bergen. He was trying to do things in Oslo, but he didn't feel that people really understood, and didn't embrace modern music, which is interesting to think about today, because he really wanted people in Norway to experience the new music from the world, and they were closed for it, you know. But and then on the other hand, when he was traveling, which he was most often doing in the winter season, he was longing for Norway, for the nature, for his house at Trollhaugen, for the silence, so he could compose. So he was, you know, it's a bit tragic because he never really seemed to be happy where he was. And I used to identify quite a lot with that earlier. I felt, oh, I do understand Grieg and that feeling, you know, never really being happy where you are. Fortunately, after I got a family, I feel much more happy at home. So, and also when I travel, because I'm dependent on also the time on my own and the touring life, and it's been part of my life since I was 18. Yeah, I mean, they needed also somebody like Edvard Munch, of course, was not being understood in Norway. Had
the
great
painter,
success. Germany seems to be a place where all of them, it was liberating for all of them.
One more thing, then we're going to talk about your touring. Grieg, in my study of him, studied in Leipzig, heard Robert Schumann's music played by Clara Schumann, was deeply influenced, I believe, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, by Schumann's piano concerto. Are they both in A minor? And in your study, how did Schumann's piano concerto influence Grieg in his piano concerto?
I mean, very clearly. Of course, it's especially about the first movement, which is really modeled. I mean, the Grieg concerto is modeled on Schumann's A minor concerto, and you know, it starts with descending chords in the piano, just sort of fanfare opening, then main theme presented by the winds, then by the piano. It's identical in both concertos. Even things like accompanying figures are quintuplets often. Like I mean, Grieg really copies this from Schumann. You know, this kind of in the development section you have wind solos, piano accompanying in both concertos. The end after the cadenza is a sort of folk-like new motive. I mean, it's endless, the comparisons, but emotionally the music makes such a different impact. And it's also composed in a very different way, even if the form, if the structure is the same. Schumann is much more sophisticated and urban, and he bases everything on few motives. Everything in all three movements actually he bases on this ba 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 be, you know, the on this motive. And Grieg is not there. He takes different motives, different song-like melodies, very beautiful. Grieg is more about it. Grieg's concerto seems more to be a force of nature, has more waves, is sometimes very outwardly dramatic, has very sort of Lisztian passages in the piano, you know, pianistically. Has the sort of sweep in the wonderful string section at the beginning of the second movement, you know, could be reminiscent of some Tchaikovsky or but there is a simplicity at the core of it, which is very endearing and speaks to the heart of people. And it speaks to the heart in such a different way than the Schumann. And they're both absolutely great pieces, I think. And it's so interesting that they have so much in common, but still make such different and wonderful impact, both of them.
Well, a question that just came to my mind that I don't know the answer to, and maybe you do. In that mix in Leipzig where Schumann had already either died or was just unwell, and Clara was the leading figure, I wonder if Grieg ever met and got to know Johannes Brahms in that world.
He did, and Brahms. I mean, Grieg was very much liked by Brahms and also Tchaikovsky, and there's supposed to be have been a dinner where with the three of them, where and Brahms and Tchaikovsky had a thing, which they often started arguing, and I mean they were very different personalities, and they looked very differently at things, and they were more stubborn. Grieg was more flexible. He wasn't there, so he was sort of the in-between person in these discussions. And at some point, he found it so exhausting that he said to his wife, who was on the other side of the table, she said, "Now you have to sit here. You have to sit here at dessert because this is getting too much for me."
It's a good thing Wagner wasn't there.
Very good, yeah.
Wagner having been born in Leipzig, people forget that.
Yes.
Because he grew up in Dresden, but he was born in Leipzig.
That's right.
And did his studies there later on. So you are now embarking on a tour. And if I'm correct, you gave your first concert of the tour last night. Is it pronounced Ålesund?
Ålesund. It's a wonderful little town on Norwegian west coast, and it's very special because of its Jugend architecture, and everything is so well preserved there. It's a very special place. It was a joy to be, and now I'm actually, as we speak, I'm backstage in the wonderful, relatively new hall in Stavanger, also in Western Norway, and I'm doing a recital here tomorrow, and then in the opera in Oslo. The also rather new, wonderful opera in Oslo on Sunday. And then I take this program.
And I have it written down: Prague, Berlin, Vienna, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Paris, 2 times in London, Brussels, and Bordeaux. And I'm going to get to my big question in a moment about that, but let's talk for a moment about the Opera House in Oslo. It is a fascinating place. I remember when they were planning it and building it and debating it, and I went to the opening, and it's an astonishing thing that has transformed the cityscape. One of my strong memories is not a memory that everyone has. This being Norway, there are a lot of sheep, and the benches and seats in the lobby had shearling, in other words, sheep's fur, sheep's wool in their natural state. And I remember walking into the building the day that it opened, and it smelled like sheep everywhere because they had not yet aired out the shearling. And facing these sheep shearling benches were the places where one would check one's coat. And there were slim poles that opened into torch lights so that the ceiling was lit with the same poles. There was no coat check person. This being Norway, you go and you hang up your coat. In Stockholm and Denmark, you give your coat to someone who guards the coat. But in Helsinki and in Oslo, it's the honor system, and you hang up your coat and there's no concern about anything happening to it. This leads to my big question. Ålesund, Stavanger, Oslo, Prague, Vienna, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Paris, twice in London, Brussels, Bordeaux. These are all different spaces. I imagine it's the Opera House in Bordeaux. I don't know, are you in the Barbican in London? I'm not sure which.
I'm in the Wigmore Hall.
Wigmore Hall, okay, that's a very different space. Each theater has its own history, its own design, its own acoustics. Some were built for opera, some were built for concerts, some are quite small, some are very big. unlike an opera singer who travels with her voice or a violinist who travels with his violin, not every pianist travels with his own piano. Some few did. I knew Vladimir Horowitz and I dealt with him and his piano a lot. But the variables that a pianist faces are different than the variables that a singer or violinist will face, in that each hall you go to has its own acoustics and materials that it's made of, its own size, and you receive a different piano. Would you describe for someone listening who may not know anything involved in how a pianist arrives at a new theater, faces the piano, and determines how he will play the same music that he may have played before and will play after in different spaces? How does that work on a concert tour?
Yeah, well, it makes it very interesting and exciting, and sometimes very frustrating, because you know, feel maybe I was very happy with the concert yesterday, and then I get to a completely new situation and I have to rethink so many things, because I do believe that the room, I mean, there are artists that think you should always play the same. You should do, you should have your tempies, you know, these are the tempies I do for in this Beethoven sonata, whatever. I don't believe that. I think the room is very much part of the experience, and you do instinctively and sometimes decisively play different in a room which is very resonant compared to a room which is very dry. Also depends on the size of the room. Are people very close to you? Are they far away? And of course the pianos. And I have this situation now. I played a recital yesterday in Ålesund, and I came here. The piano is a little bit heavier to play, but it has a great beauty of sound. The hall here is much more resonant. It's I'm after we have talked, actually, I'm going back and working inside the hall and trying to get to know this acoustic, and I'm playing here tomorrow. And that's the problem is when you don't have enough time for that, and when you, I mean, my best and most important friends are the piano technicians, the ones that are really good, because they can really change so much. You know, I sometimes compare it to Formula One cars. You need somebody who's there to really always be ready to make changes at the last minute, you know, right before a concert. Or there are certain things you can do with voicing. You can sometimes do radical things. If a piano sounds very sharp, you can voice the hammers of a piano so that suddenly it sounds much softer, much smoother, much more mellow. You can also try to do the opposite thing, which is a bit more difficult, but the good piano technicians can really bring a piano up if it doesn't sound enough. There are all kinds of things about the action which you can change. You can make it lighter. You can, well, make it have more resistance, which you sometimes need as well. These are very important people in my life. And I love when I get to places where there's a piano technician that I trust and don't even have to speak much with, but just there's this feeling of understanding between us. And then in the evening you have a piano where you feel, now we can really give voice to everything that I feel about this music.
Now, there are in the world different piano manufacturers, and there are famous historic ones in Italy and Vienna and Paris and Germany and New York and Queens, the Steinway. And every theater has its own piano or group of pianos if it's a bigger theater. And do they advise you ahead of time which brand or which make of piano they will have for you when you arrive? And so, do you adapt accordingly, knowing the characteristics of the different manufacturing the pianos?
Well, I will always check beforehand what pianos they have. They might have one or two or three. There might be different manufacturers, though. I do normally play on Steinway. Not always, but I do feel very much at home with the tone of this of a Steinway, and I feel in most concert halls that's what gives me the greatest pleasure. But I mean, a Steinway can be many things as well. They can be wonderful Steinways, and they can be worn-out Steinways, and they can be Steinway which is not very friendly to me, and I don't. So every instrument is different, but normally I do play on Steinway if I can, and then you just have to try to get to know that instrument like you get to know a person very quickly. And the fingers have to adapt. It happens, of course, you're thinking certain things when you try the piano, but it's very much about neurological reaction in the fingertips, and how after a while the fingers start to learn how to treat this particular piano to get what I feel, to get a singing tone, to get the balance between voices and everything, you know, is how is the bass reacting compared to the middle register or the melodic register, and as you say, in the whole, how that, what do I get back from the whole, what do I hear, what kind of overtones, and can I trust what I hear from the. Sometimes I then have friends or maybe some local people, and I ask them, you know, or maybe I have a local pianist to play for me, and I go out in the hall and listen a little bit, and sometimes I will be very surprised because it might be a very different experience in the hall that what I'm hearing. So just have to use the possibilities I have to get to know the place I am and the instrument which I have to use that particular evening.
My father was a professional trombonist, and after I was born, he did not want to tour so much, and he learned to become a piano tuner. So he continued to play trombone in New York, but didn't play it elsewhere. But an increasing part of his life was, number one, music editing, but number two, tuning pianos. And I, as a kid, got to know a lot of very interesting musicians, and especially opera singers, by going into their homes with my dad while he tuned their piano. And I would watch him work in great detail and talk to the musicians and see the musicians sit with my father and ask for different things to be done. I grew up, I learned the clarinet, so I didn't learn the piano at all. But I remember being fascinated as a small child by the pedals on a piano. And for someone who is not a pianist who might be listening or studied piano, would you talk about, number one, what the pedals do, but number two, your thinking as an interpreter? Let's for now say the Grieg Piano Concerto, but it could be anything. Something by Debussy would be completely different, perhaps. About your use of pedals and how it relates to the music you play, but also to the space that you're playing in.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big question. I mean, we basically talk about the two main pedals, right? The shift pedal and the sustain pedal, and then the left pedal, which is gives the possibility to play softer. And with both of them, it so much depends on the space and on the piano. But especially with the sustain pedal, you know, obviously if you play in a dry acoustic, you can use more pedal. If you play in a very, very reverberant hall, sometimes you have to play almost without pedal at all to make things clear. And totally dependent on which music I'm playing, of course, but it's important that the harmonies are not muddled in most of the music I'm playing. So I feel the pedal is such an essential part of the piano. I mean, there are pianists who play, for instance, Bach without pedal, without any pedal at all, and I just cannot imagine that. I feel it's so much, for me, part of what the instrument is. But of course, it's very important that the things don't get muddled up. And in Bach, for instance, I mean, it's very, very important. And you can easily just make it sound sort of kitschy or romantic or something if you use too much pedal. Yeah, it totally depends on the music. It totally depends on the room. So there was no general with the left pedal. I like this thing, which Arthur Rubinstein, I remember, said, I have this trick. I put down the left pedal and then I play my melodies really forte. And then I get this clarity, and still it has this sort of beauty of tone. And he was onto something. He put it in such a simple way, but I do know what he means, and I do that quite often myself, because you can get a sort of a little bit of a veiled quality to it, and still it can sing, but not with a full voice, but with a little bit more sotto voce and still beautiful and singing. And in certain halls, I use that quite a lot, and I'm a great fan of the left pedal. Actually, there are many pianists who don't use it so much, but I think it has many possibilities if it's well adjusted, and sometimes also to use it halfway. So I'm using that a lot, and find that to get real intimate color at the piano, I use the left pedal.
So much I want to ask you. One last question regarding preparing for a hall in each theater that you go to. Because you are Leif Ove Andsnes, the theater is sold out. And therefore, when you are, whenever I've heard you, that's all I can say. Therefore, when you are testing your piano and the sound and the acoustics and reverberation, typically you're doing it in an empty hall. And if you then enter Carnegie Hall, which has 2,800 seats approximately, or whatever hall you're in, whether it's Wigmore, which is a very different space, but can have a lot of people, or the Opera House in Bordeaux, which is a very different shape. These are all different places. I assume the San Carlo in Lisbon, or maybe the Gulbenkian, I don't know, but those are very different spaces. And when they fill up and you have people and they're wearing clothing, and we hope, and so on, that changes again the space from the empty hall that you have rehearsed in. How do you factor that in?
Well, for several of the places you just mentioned now, Carnegie Hall, Wigmore Hall, and the Gulbenkian, and they are halls that do get better when people are in there. Okay. And fortunately, and sometimes when you play an empty Wigmore Hall, it's just it's too much. It's like a little bit of a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. And you feel a bit lost in the sound, and then it fills with people, and suddenly it has this clarity in addition to that rich reverberant sound that it has in that hall. And it's the same in Carnegie Hall. I mean, you're sitting there alone in the empty room, and it feels so huge, and where's the sound actually going here? Is there any direction to it? Is there anything I get back? And then a magical thing happens when it fills up and you feel it gets into focus. There's a center to it. It's absolutely, I find that particularly wonderful with solo piano in that hall. I mean, imagine how big it is. 2,800 people. And there's intimacy to it.
Yeah.
There's such a beautiful intimacy to it. You can really play soft, and at the same time there's this open sound, and rich and just wonderful. It has everything. I think it's, for me, the space is perfect for solo piano, maybe better than for orchestra.
I want New Yorkers and people nearby to know that you will be there on January 31st, 2023. I have my tickets.
And I'm
Um,
so looking forward. It's been a while, of course, because of the pandemic and everything. So.
yes, I know. You'll be on a US tour, 9 performances in, it looks like 12 days, beginning in La Jolla, California, and ending January 31st in Carnegie Hall. On your program now and when you toured North America, you're doing a work that I know snippets of, I've never heard it played completely, by Antonin Dvorak, the poetic tone pictures. And if I'm not mistaken, purely coincidental, I didn't plan this, your recording of that comes out today.
It's out today. Yeah.
It's out today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you are playing it in as part of your program in the cities, European cities and North American cities I named. Would you tell me and our listeners anything you want to about the piece? Because I love Dvorak, but I don't know it.
It's such a discovery for me, though it's strange to say that, because I have strangely known that, at least on the surface, since I was little, because my father brought with him a random set of LPs when he was once in London. And he came home, and among those LPs, there was one with Radoslav Kvapil, the Czech pianist, playing poetic tone pictures by Dvorak. So I listened to those, and especially the first ones was very appealing to me when I was a child. And I played the very first one, the Twilight Way, in a youth competition when I was 12. And later in my 20s, I played a group of them. And then I forgot a little bit about them. And then a few years ago, I thought, maybe I should look at this. And then the pandemic gave me the opportunity to do things. You know, we all had more time on our hands at home, and I thought I should look through Dvorak's piano music, because nobody plays it. What is this? And I looked through a lot, and some of it I found a little uneven, a little bit awkward for the instrument. And then I got to this cycle again. I thought, what a wonderful cycle it is. And then I found a quote from Dvorak saying that he's writing to a friend, saying that I've tried to be a poet a la Schumann in these pieces, though it doesn't sound like Schumann, he says. And I hope somebody will have the courage to play all of them together. Which was such a wonderful thing to see, because it confirmed me what I started feeling, that this is meant as a cycle. It's not just a random set of pieces, but he thought of them as a journey. And it's 55 minutes of music, 13 pieces. It's substantial, but it does make so much sense actually as a journey. And I love the mixture between sort of mysterious spiritual pieces, like at the Old Castle or at the Hero's Grave or Twilight Way, and then sort of the everyday life. There's a piece called Tittle Tattle, just small talk. There's one called Toying, and I love that mix. It's a little bit like Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition sometimes.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
And I love how he writes for the piano, the different textures for different pieces. And the reason why his piano music is not much played is because he was not a pianist, and the piano music has this strange reputation that it's awkward, that it's not really successful. And it's so unfair when it comes to these pieces, because he actually has a real voice. You can see sometimes that he chooses piano techniques that he knows works from other composers. Like the fourth piece is called the Spring Song, and it's very Mendelssohnian or Lisztian in its figures. In the Bacchanal, there's a trio which is very reminiscent of Chopin's Third Scherzo. There are things like that. There's a little bit of Grieg, a little bit of Tchaikovsky, but at the same time, there's such a signature from him. I think I just find it such a marvelous cycle, and incredible that one as a pianist can find this today and think that this is music which is not known in the world by such a beloved composer.
Yeah.
So it's great. I mean, it's a wonderful feeling to be championing it and to bring it on such a long tour as I'm doing.
I don't know if I'm sure you know, but I don't know if listeners know the degree to which Dvorak was a big protagonist in my city, in New York, in that we know of his spending summers with people in communities in Iowa, but he spent much of the year here in New York City on East 17th and East 16th Street near Union Square, where there was a music academy. And he taught there. He taught young musicians. He was very taken with the sounds and the energy of New York City. And very specifically, we know that on October 12th of 1892, the 400th anniversary of what is described as Columbus's arrival, that's a very controversial topic now. But at that time, Italians in New York looked at Columbus as a model of heroism because Italians were not well regarded. They had menial jobs and often enslaved, especially in New Orleans. They faced slavery when Blacks were thankfully officially liberated, if not de facto liberated. And Dvorak came to know African Americans here. And Harry T. Burley was the name of his prize student, who was a Black man, who taught him the music. It was a spiritual called Coming Home that becomes the Largo in the Symphony from the New World, number 9. And he composed it here and in Iowa, and it premiered at Carnegie Hall, conducted by Dvorak, and for the New York Philharmonic, and the score belongs to the New York Philharmonic. So next time you're here and you have a moment, go over to the beautiful New Geffen Hall and have a look in their archives at the score that he created here. He's a composer that we New Yorkers feel very deeply.
I understand that, and it's so touching how he was able to incorporate the American sounds into his. I mean, he wasn't the young composer at this time, but he was able to adapt. And I mean, something like the Sonatina for violin and piano, for instance, how American that sounds sometimes, and of course the New World Symphony, yeah, and this music which I'm playing is just written a few years before he emigrates to, or before he moved and had that long stay in America, and it's really, you know, becoming his best period, and where he starts to get interested in programmatic music. So that's also part of this, that it seems to have liberated him. To have this imagery, and you know, it's around the time of the 8th Symphony, which originally had a program, and it's shortly after the wonderful second piano quintet, and it's a glorious time of his music, and of course these pieces are not less. I mean, they are, for me, really on the same level.
Yeah. So you take on big projects, which I think is a wonderful thing. And while we all know the names Beethoven and Mozart, you have taken very original, deep dives into these composers, even in the famous works, but also maybe some of the less famous works. Would you start by talking about the Beethoven journey, what that is, how it was conceived? You did it with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, and why what is it and why the Beethoven journey?
Well, the Beethoven journey came out from a sort of wish from my side to dive into one composer for a few years. I had felt that as a pianist, you have to be a chameleon all the time, and you have to play everything from Baroque music to the latest contemporary music. And then, of course, Beethoven had been part of my life, but I felt this music was becoming more and more important to me. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 years and simply only play Beethoven. And then I was so lucky that I got the Mahler Chamber Orchestra as my artistic partners in what would be where the piano concertos would be center of focus. I was also doing Beethoven sonatas and Beethoven chamber music for myself in this period, but the piano concertos were the main focus, the piano concertos and the choral fantasy. And so over 3 years, we made 3 recordings with these 6 pieces, and we toured them a lot. And the last season, we played in 10 different cities, I think, all of the pieces in different sort of residencies. And that was a revelation for me, because I felt that we had worked so much with it. Everybody was so conscious of what their role was in the score, what they were doing, and it led to a kind of freedom in performances which were new for me. And I thought, this is where I want to be. This is what it's all about. You cannot get to this kind of result in a normal orchestra week. You need to spend time. So when we were finished with this project, we're saying that it'd be wonderful to do another project sometime, and that's what we have been doing the last years, which is Mozart.
Well, before we get to Mozart, I have a Beethoven question. Who conducted?
Well, I conducted, and that was, of course, or let's say I led the orchestra. I don't like to call myself conductor, because I'm not. But when I become quite used to leading the orchestra when I have the piano in front of me. So I'm sitting in the middle of the orchestra, no lid on the piano, and I have the orchestra around me. And there are some advantages, great advantages in this way, because we hear each other so well, we see each other also so well. I remember from the Beethoven project, there was simply, in terms of ensemble playing, there was a place in the end of the first concerto, in the last movement, which is very tricky, where you have this motive going between the winds, and the piano is playing just scales, and this has to fit together. And with every conductor, whoever expert there was there, it would always be a little bit difficult to put together. And the first time I did it, just sitting in the middle of the orchestra, was no problem, because we heard each other so well. So to be really feeling the same music was so easy. And there are so many places like that. And of course, some people will say that, well, it's a little bit shame that you're with the back to the audience when you play concerts. And when you don't have a lid on the piano, the piano has less clarity.
That was my question, yeah.
So that can be a challenge, also very much depending on the hall. And it makes me have to play with quite a lot of substance sometimes. And so, you can't win. You sacrifice something. But for the feeling of playing together, feeling the music together, breathing together, having a real dialogue on stage, there are great things are happening. And that, led us to the next project, which is Mozart, where there's even more dialogue, I would say.
But I'll get to that in a moment. Here's the obvious question that a lot of people don't know the answer to. If you are both conducting or leading and using your hands for the piano, how do you conduct and lead if you sometimes have to have your fingers on the keys?
You can show gestures, you can use your head sometimes, or you can simply, body language. But when I worked with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, it was also so much about us feeling the music together, and them, that we felt the same gestures, that we felt the same timing in certain places, and them listening to what I did and learning where to come in and so on. And so when I worked with them, it didn't seem to be much of a problem. But if you have to do things very efficiently with one rehearsal or so, of course, it can be challenging. And especially when you get to the fourth and the fifth concerto, which has more transitions. And in the fifth concerto, you're I'm playing basically all the time.
Yeah.
There's not much time to be conducting away from the keyboard. So there were certain places which I was very nervous about, but I was happy to see how quickly we could do those transitions and to make them work very easily.
When I speak to conductors, they often talk about, let's say they're on a tour and going to different halls, of seating their musicians differently depending on the space and the acoustic and so forth, and what the music is. But even assuming they're playing the same piece repeatedly, they may seat the musicians differently. Do you, as the leader, when you are working with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, let's not even talk about different halls, just one hall, do you seat them differently because you're at the keyboard looking at them than you might otherwise? And is it about seeing them as well as hearing them? And what comes first, the hearing or the seeing?
Well, I try as much as possible to have them as close as I can. And that especially goes with the wind players. You know, sometimes we find ourselves I play a Mozart concerto on stage with an orchestra, and they're all spread out because after the intermission, they have to do a Bruckner symphony, and they they have to use the large stage. It just doesn't work. You cannot be. I cannot, as a pianist, be very far from the oboe or the bassoon. This is chamber music. We have to be close. We have to hear each other. We have to be able to breathe together. So that's for me the most important thing when I lead the chamber orchestra, to have the woodwinds really close. I mean, just at the end of the piano, so that we have that intimacy, that we can have an intimate dialogue.
So one more question before we get to Mozart, as we will. Have you conducted music where you're not at the piano, where you are the conductor?
No, I haven't actually. And I don't anymore have the wish for that. I mean, I do realize that I know 100 times more about playing the piano than I do about conducting. So it's not, I don't have an ambition to be a conductor. Also, I play an instrument which has such a wealth of repertoire. There's so much I want to do. So I don't have the time to spend to look stupid in front of an orchestra for weeks and weeks before I start to learn things a bit better. And so no, I don't, but I do enjoy very much the situation with the chamber orchestra in Viennese classical music. So I've done the Haydn concertos, I've done a lot of Mozart and Beethoven, and for me it stops there. I would not go on. I would not do the Schumann concerto. I would certainly not do the Brahms concertos without a conductor. You know, for these pieces, you really need a conductor because of the flexibility of tempi, and because it becomes so symphonic in a way as well.
The reason I asked you that question is the way you spoke before about pedals, and I envisioned the right pedal and the left pedal. And when I talk to conductors, they go into great detail, in each one in his or her own way, about the right hand and the left hand. And George Schulte, who was not shy, once said to me, the right hand is for the music. The left hand is the hand of God. And if you look at videos of George Schulte, his use of his left hand was something so eloquent and beautiful that it was something he thought about, whereas other conductors may not to the same degree, and that's not a judgment. But it came to mind when you were talking about how you use the right and the left pedal for different means of expression and communication. So let's get to Mozart now. Mozart momentum. What is that?
Well, I was just thinking about Mozart quote when you said this, because Mozart, said that the between the right and the left hand when playing the piano, that the left hand keeps the rhythm. So it's a little bit the opposite way from the conductor.
Yeah.
The left hand keeps the rhythm, and the right hand can feel free around that, which is a very interesting for thinking that he the kind of rubato he used would be in the right hand, but still the left hand would keep the time. So Mozart Momentum is based on the idea of something special happening in 1785, and it starts with the D minor concerto number 20, where I do feel that he does something very radical. He starts to separate a little bit the soloist from the orchestra. I mean, he was in such a flow of writing concertos. The previous year, he had written 6 piano concertos. They were wonderful pieces. But then can't get away from the fact that something starts to happen. January 85, he writes his first concerto in minor key. Of course, that gives it also a different character. The D minor concerto is very much sort of Don Giovanni kind of drama. Starts very restless and dramatic in the orchestra, and then when the piano comes in, it's with a voice completely different, with a singing line which we haven't heard in the introduction from the orchestra, and that's new. That hasn't happened. I mean, I don't know of any piano concerto or any other concerto at all that where this has been done before. You would always elaborate on the material you have heard the orchestra present. And for me, it's clear that Mozart was thinking, okay, I'm onto something here, because he starts to explore that also in his next concertos. And Beethoven, of course, loved this. I mean, he takes that immediately and says, oh, what can we do with this? And for every concerto, he becomes more and more radical. And when he gets to his 4th, he starts the whole thing with the piano, and it becomes completely wild. And in a way, this separation then with the piano with the soloist becoming more free from the orchestra is also the sort of beginning of maybe the romantic concerto, the heroic concerto. Maybe the Beethoven's Emperor is the first one of that kind. But it starts here, I think, in 1785. And for me, it's the moment of the concerto genre. And by doing this, he, of course, creates a different possibility for narrative and psychological drama. It's like the soloist is this individual apart from society, or sometimes in dialogue with society, but sometimes also apart from it. And it's, of course, becomes more and more operatic. And the Mozart Momentum is about 1785-86, and it's about the same time as he writes Marriage of Figaro.
Yep.
And we see that in the concertos, how they become more and more operatic, and how he gives so much individuality to the wind players. In the concertos 22, 23, 24, there are long sections where, well, I'm as a pianist, I'm just listening to what the wind players are doing. And he treats them like singers sometimes.
I think that every person who loves music has a moment when he or she hears something for the first time and is so completely moved, devastated, blown away, that you make your relationship to music, all music, before that hearing and after that hearing. And for me, it was Kirchel 488, the 23rd Piano Concerto, that I didn't hear in a concert hall. I heard it in a film, and I only heard the second movement, and it was a French film, and I have no memory of what the film was, because when the music came on, I was so overwhelmed that I stayed for the credits to see what the music was. And at that time, this was a cinema on Broadway and 63rd Street, and Tower Records was across the way. I just ran across the street and bought the recording. And the second move, I mean, I love the first and the third movements, but the second movement is, to me, the most emotional, most heartfelt music I know. And there's a lot of emotional, heartfelt music from all music, not just classical. But I remember that experience and bursting into tears in the film. And the person I was with asked, why are you crying? It's not a sad film. And I said, no, it's the music. I can't remember the film at all, but I remember the experience of the music. So if you would kindly tell me how you approach that particular concerto, what your feelings are about Kirchhoff 488.
Well, yeah, it's just amazing how Mozart is everywhere emotionally, and how he can also within one moment just change, and from fanfare to a charming phrase, and then suddenly you have this moment of sadness or loneliness. And but then there are these particular moments, of course, like this one which you mentioned, the Siciliano in F sharp minor.
Yeah.
I mean, the key, I don't know another Mozart movement in that key. I mean, maybe it exists, but I don't know. And it's so black. It's really music of sorrow. At the same time, there's something so, I don't know, universally uplifting or comforting about it. I mean, it has the sort of quality that very few other, Bach has this, you know, in the Passions, so he can create that sort of thing. And Mozart was there. It's incredible that he could give voice to that sorrow and pain, and still no self-pity about it.
Yeah.
Do
we know that it was he who played the premieres of these works?
Yeah, he was basically, he was such an entrepreneur, you know. He was organizing his own concerts. He was he was selling the tickets. He was writing all the music. He was hiring the musicians. He was doing rehearsals. He was playing all the music. Yeah, he was in charge, and he was famous improviser. Of course, people wanted to come and see what he's going to do next. And I think that's part of these concertos why they are so different. I mean, you see after the D minor comes the C major 1 month later. Sort of twin concertos. They have some of the same motives, but on a completely different way, and with completely different character, these pieces.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's also a way of showing that some of the same people that came to the concerts, you know, look, I can also do this. And there must have been colleagues coming to the concerts, and composer colleagues of Mozart, and he wants to show what he could do.
You embark on these big projects, which I love, and I follow you doing it. And your current big project, I suppose, as part of your concert tour, is the Dvorak. Does this come through reading and research? Does it come through what appeals to you next as an artist? How does it awaken in you that the next thing I need to do is the Beethoven Journey or the Mozart Momentum, or in this case, we know about the pandemic and you're delving into the Dvorak? Is there something, you don't have to tell me what the next one is, I'll come to whatever it is. Is there something germinating in you now? And it's like having sand in an oyster and the pearl comes eventually, but it's a lot of scratching and irritation to make that happen.
Yeah, at the moment, I don't have a project in mind, actually. I'm sort of enjoying at the moment, just thinking about many possibilities for the future. And I don't know, especially with this project with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, it's ended up being, you know, large projects, 3-year projects, several recordings. It's been wonderful, but it doesn't all need to be like that. But I think in my life, recordings have played a very important part of focusing my ideas of repertoire and what I should work on. And for a while I did a lot of Schubert. I recorded Schubert sonatas, or I would one composer focus, like I've now Dvorak, or I did Liszt or Janáček or Carl Nielsen or Sibelius, or, you know, there were these, and recordings led me to the luxury of being able to focus on projects like that. And it's been a wonderful gift, and it's very developing, because you learn so much by recording and to work towards the recording.
I want listeners to know that I placed a link on the show page to all of your recordings on Idaccio so that they can do a deep dive with you. Before we conclude, and I thank you because, as I said to you, I've been looking forward to this for years, this conversation. You have collaborated with great singers, Matthias Gerner recently in Winterreise in Paris, and you have released a recording with your fellow Norwegian, Lisa Davidson, who is, I met her very briefly in Carnegie Hall one night. We had a 2-minute chat, and I said, I love Norway. She said, so do I. And that was it. But she is a phenomenon in her way. I know that Kirsten Flagstad, the great Norwegian soprano of 70, 80 years ago, was considered a phenomenon. And we have a similar thing here with Lisa Davidson, who I heard very early on in her career, actually. And she has now a soaring career, and she's still in her 30s, and is an exponent in her way of Norway because small country, huge star. And both of you collaborated on a recording of Grieg. And we discussed, you and I already, the bringing the Norwegian-ness to that, so we don't have to do that again. But in working with someone where there's almost a shorthand about the language and the culture, how did you and Lisa Davidson conceive of and pursue this album of songs by Edvard Grieg?
Well, I mentioned with my Dvorak recording that the pandemic gave me an opportunity to get into this repertoire again, but with this album it was actually a real blessing to have some time, because I obviously had a lot of concert tours cancelled. Lisa had even more canceled because she's basically doing big opera productions, and that was impossible during the pandemic. Norway wasn't completely closed for concerts. I mean, we were doing smaller concerts for maybe, I was sometimes playing recitals for 50 people or up to 200, never more than 200. And then the pandemic gave us, we had talked about doing a Grieg album. Lisa had asked me a few years ago, and I said, yes, absolutely. I'd love to do that. I had never done a project with Grieg songs, and I do consider it maybe his greatest music. And then, so we had possibility to grow into this together, which was so wonderful. We met several times and just worked with no concert in sight, just 1 or 2 days of rehearsals, and then met again 2 months later in Bergen or in Oslo, and could develop this together and find a voice. And Lisa, of course, has such a unique voice, and it's a huge voice. It's dramatic, but it's so flexible. She can do so much with it. And I was extremely impressed to see how she could find her way to some of the more folk-like songs in which doesn't have a tradition in Norway for her kind of voices, or people would rather think that she doesn't fit that kind of repertoire. But she found such a natural way to it, I think, and to see the way that she found her voice in Haugtussa, the wonderful cycle. I think it's called The Mountain Maid in English, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is a famous song cycle in Norway, not so much internationally because it's in Norwegian language. And that cycle is often done with a light soprano voice. And to see how she made it something of her own, and to see how that music could take on the drama that she gives us, the darkness of the voice, the velvety color, the rich vocabulary of sounds that she can create, and also that it led sometimes to slower tempis, and she has an amazing breath, of course. So the last piece of the Vejetlebekken which is, I think, is such a highlight from Grieg, which I always dreamt of as having this sort of feeling of eternity. Just we are doing it quite a bit slower than what it's normally done, because she can do it with her voice and
breath. Yeah.
And I just love that. And we had the opportunity then to do a couple of small concerts in Norway with this repertoire during the pandemic, and then thought, well, now we can actually record this, because we have found it, which was a great job.
So final question. You as a collaborative pianist, I don't like the word accompanist, and my friends who do this don't say accompanist, they say collaborative pianist when working with another musician, in this case a singer. When you study the music in these songs that you're doing with Matthias Gerna, with Lisa Davidson, do you study the words, and do you take messages and information and inspiration from the words in how you approach your piano playing?
Yes. But especially as a sort of, to get the whole picture. I mean, these songs, you do Schubert songs, and the notes and the harmonies and the rhythms and everything is so beautiful in itself. It's enough.
Yeah.
It's absolutely enough. But of course, I remember I had an epiphany. I was working through the words, through the lyrics of the Schöne Müllerin there was a wonderful singer who was retired in Bergen called Sif Pettersen. She had worked at opera houses in Germany when she was young, and she had become a German teacher later in life. And I had the opportunity to work through these cycles with her, word by word, sentence by sentence. And when I understood in the Schöne Müllerin that, oh, this is maybe suicide in the end, it's that painful. When I understood the whole drama of it, and it was so overwhelming for me. And I thought, of course I need to know this about every song I'm doing. This can really change things. So I try to, obviously in the Greek songs it was easier because it was our language.
Yeah. And you just reminded me, my German teacher was Norwegian. Hello, Sigrid, if you're listening.
Oh, really?
Yes. Forgot that. Leif Ove Andsnes, how can I thank you? I will thank you by continuing to listen and derive inspiration from your music making. I will attend on January 31st in Carnegie Hall. I encourage my friends in all the cities who listen, and all the ones I named, if you've never had the experience of hearing Leif Ove Andsnes play, do it. And if you have, then you know already, and you're going to do it again. Thank you very much. Did I leave anything out?
Can I have a final question for you?
Of course.
I was wondering, since the very beginning of this interview, what was that food, that Norwegian food that you were eating in the Siemens
So
church?
I knew that you were going to say that, and I was going to say herring. And I adore herring. It's also in the New York Jewish tradition to eat herring, and Russian tradition, and Ukrainian, and so forth. And so we have a lot of herring here. But what I learned at the smorgasbord, and I mean this very seriously, and you don't know, I've written 7 cookbooks, so I know what I'm doing here. I learned about food pairings, about textures, flavors, what combines, what does not. I learned about not filling up your plate because it's all there, but moderately filling your plate, savoring every single thing, allowing the persistence. It's like keeping your foot on the pedal, allowing the persistence of a flavor to go through your mouth, your nose, your throat, your body, your system, before taking the next bite, and seeing how the texture of the crisp bread goes with the fattiness of the herring and the slightly nutty flavor of the jet toast, which is the cheese. And every single item I tasted, because all of this was new to me, I learned about tasting, about savoring, that you don't just eat, you savor, you use your senses completely. And no one taught me that, but that's what I learned at the smorgasbord. And every week I'd go back and I would have another kind of herring and compare it to the herring I knew from the week before. So you're building up knowledge
Wonderful.
and history and sense memory. And so I came to this first through food, although music was always right there in my family, and later music, and even later spoken language. I came late to spoken language. The other senses came first.
Right.
And I know it changed me as a person, that experience every week at the smorgasbord, because of how my senses were engaged. And it made me the person I am, in part.
Maybe that food was better than any food you could get in Norway. I've had the best fish cake in my life in Seattle at the Sons of Norway reception. And I'm brought up with that stuff, but that was the top.
Have you been to Minnesota, which has a large Norwegian population?
Of course, yeah.
And there, I mean, I've spent time in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where I went to school. The communities are there, but sometimes when I do food research, I go to immigrant communities because they do older preparations. Let's say Milan has moved far on from the food it may have done in 1750 or 1850 when Verdi was eating it. But in these immigrant communities of people from Lombardy, say in southern Brazil, you find that they prepare things as was done 100, 200 years ago. So I call this sort of food archaeology, that I go to immigrant communities to learn how the food used to taste in Italy, used to taste in Norway, and so on. And, you know, it's a lifelong pleasure. I do it 3 times a day. Thank you. I genuinely thank you. It has been an honor and a pleasure, and I love learning, and you've taught me a lot, and you've given me so much insight in my life as someone who loves and cares about music. And I'm glad that you could share that with my audience. And everyone, go hear Leif Ove Andsnes at a city near you.